Welcome to Satori Sounds, the podcast that invites you to unwind, relax, and explore the deeper currents of life. In each episode, we dive into various concepts, offering casual discussions that encourage reflection, growth, and leave you with some principles that you can apply today. So join us on a journey of discovery. In this episode, we explore the themes of intentionality and awareness, offering some tools that we found useful and some key principles for balancing emotions and reasoning. But before we begin, let's take a moment to think about this episode's quote. Make a decision today that tomorrow's you will be proud of.
I was thinking about this earlier, and obviously we wanted to talk about intentionality today, but I was also thinking about it from the perspective of when you want to be so intentional that it almost puts you off course. You fall into perfectionism, you know? And I think that's what we fell into and I'll be open with anyone that's going to listen to this in the future, because we recorded this episode. It was tricky for us, and we were like, we need to do this, we need to say that. And we became so intentional with our message that we fell into a trap of, perfectionism. And it's so funny looking back at it and hearing what you're saying. And reviewing that with other podcasters. So
it's so obvious though when you look at it that way, and I think we all fall into that trap of this urgency that we have of perfectionism, and everything's got to be so clean. You know, the environments that we live in nowadays are so sterile, and everything's just so that actually
so perfect.
An element of authenticity can be lost in many ways, and I think that is exactly what I was reflecting on when we were talking about after our first kind of go at recording this and then listening back to it this morning. It was like, actually, ironically, we've done the very thing that we said we didn't want to do, which was take it from being a conversation through to actually being a very focused, driven, here's a message we want to deliver.
Yeah. Absolutely. Cue the Obi-Wan Kenobi. You've become what you saw you would destroy. And honestly, I think you're absolutely spot on. And, it's so weird that we both had that reflection. Because I was thinking about that literally on my drive home from work. I was just like, what's missing there? There was something gone there. And it was almost like in our focus to get it right and have a purposeful and intentional message, we kind of rehearsed, and because we rehearsed, we almost, it's like you psych yourself out sometimes, and I think that's what we did. And I think that's that other end of kind of, it's not intentionalism or intentionality. That's at that point, I think it really is that perfectionist kind of overly controlled way of doing it, and that's not what we're trying to espouse either. So it's just so wild that we came to that conclusion.
But I think that comes to one of the key kind of things that we've both been, practicing a lot. We've talked about something that we'll share in future episodes that will come up, which is that we've been doing this kind of practice every day of what we've been grateful for, what we feel drained by, and what we've learned about ourselves. And actually, taking that, framing what you've just said, I think one way you can put it is around awareness, in the sense that actually the reason that we've realised that is because we are very intentional in many ways at the moment of we're trying to help bring something that we feel is of value to people, and actually we are therefore a lot more reflective, trying to understand where we are with things. And I think the awareness of that being realised so quickly is purely down to that practice.
Yeah, I think so. And, it comes back to, and I'm going to bring up the philosopher and the monk again for the 100th time, because we've recorded it, and in every recording I've brought it up. But yeah, they frame one of their discussions in this idea of actually it's our ability to reflect on events that kind of separates us from just kind of biological processes and impulses. It's our ability to go, why is that happening? What are we doing here? What came up for me in that moment?
Definitely. And I think that that's such an odd concept in a way for many people, I think, because we subconsciously evaluate that day in, day out without really thinking. You know, we very much act, feel, and move through life, you know, without analyzing everything. And I think awareness isn't over analyzing, but I think it is.
It's beginning to unpick, isn't it?
Exactly. It's just, I think it is that observation. But it's also very hard, I think, day to day. I don't know how you found it. Have you found journaling over the last couple of weeks in trying to maintain that every day?
I've not. It is challenging, and I suppose it's the consistency of doing it, kind of finding that time to fit it in. And actually, I found myself reflecting on this idea of, well, since when do I not have 5 minutes to write a couple of words down? What's happened in my day to kind of drain me so much to make me feel? So it kind of has forced that questioning as well when I haven't done it. But I just want to come back to something you outlined really, really nicely, that kind of automaticity, or that automatic not questioning, just going through life. And, you know, that's something I think we can all really struggle with, because the way humans have evolved is we've kind of developed to make these snapshot decisions very quickly. And we form kind of cognitive heuristics to be able to do this so quickly. And actually, a lot of our programming doesn't necessarily let us slow down and do that. And I suppose it's what we're trying to encourage here is to do the opposite. And that's a skill. And I think for many people listening, it might sound like these guys are speaking gobbledygook. How do you stop and, you know, think about, you know, your everyday thoughts and questioning kind of things that are going on around you? And I suppose one of the things, you know, I've always been keen to drive home is things like, you know, the Padesky's formulation model and stuff like that, because it's a really, really helpful way of framing your thinking, framing your kind of physical sensations, framing your emotions, and framing your behavior, as well as the situation that you find yourself in and that has maybe triggered some of these things.
Absolutely. And I think that awareness and using models like that are one of the many ways that you can kind of work through things. And I think we'll come back maybe to unpack that in a moment. I wanted to go back to actually something you just said around kind of this urgency that we have, because life's so busy and fraught of distractions nowadays that I think in many ways that's why people aren't always able to be as, shall we say, as that casual observer of what they're looking at, because, you know, we're peppered from information from the moment we kind of wake up. We pick up the phone, you know, it's very easily not to be intentional in a way nowadays, because there's so much that can be done for you. And I think actually in that abundance of choice, learning some of the tools in which you can learn to be more intentionally around some of the choices that you make really does start from that awareness. And I think that's definitely where some of the applications like you've just talked about, that Padesky's model is. And I think that's probably worth unpacking for a few of the listeners who maybe haven't heard of that, of what is it and how could it possibly be used in an everyday sense?
I suppose, well, to start off with a description of Padesky's formulation model or maintenance cycle. And it's called two things. So the first one is the Padesky's maintenance cycle. And the other is more of I want to say it's more of an informal name that the author is not a fan of, but it's called the hot cross bun model. And it's effectively a little diagram, and it charts out kind of the relationships between our emotions, our thoughts, our behavior, so how we act, as well as kind of physical sensations that we get when these things are going on. And it's really, really poignant at kind of highlighting how these things go on to maintain themselves. And that sounds really, really strange, but I suppose one way might be, you know, imagine you're at work and something happens. Maybe a colleague, you know, is talking a little bit too much while you're trying to concentrate. So the thing that you do is you feel quite cross, you feel frustrated because someone's blocking your goal. you notice the thought, or you have the thought that your colleague is stupid, or maybe they're talking too much, or maybe they're doing it on purpose, and you react on that by, you know, telling them to shut up or to be quiet, and it kind of fractures the relationship a little bit, and you're kind of feeling hot. That's the bodily sensation. You're frustrated, you're warm, and your colleague responds in a way that doesn't necessarily help that situation or makes things worse. And it kind of just goes around and around and around, and it becomes a bit of a map of your kind of distress or your actions. I don't know if that example is very clear, but
no, I think it definitely is around that. It's a framework for helping people make those observations, and I also think, you know, taking further what you said around, you know, maybe how a colleague reacts or etc. I think that's where awareness can play a huge part for a lot of people, because we have no idea what's going on in other people's worlds. You know, we don't understand necessarily what's, you know, gone on in their morning, the night before, have had a minimum amount of sleep, and have actually just trying to make it through the day, you know, and actually the irritation to you, maybe they weren't even aware of because they were consumed in their own thoughts. And I think a bit of empathy comes into that as well, around that awareness. You know, I think you can, to me, hearing what you've said about that framework, I think you can, that's beneficial for your own awareness, but I think it's also something that you can do for others as well. You know, observing their behaviors, what emotions maybe they are portraying. And I think that's definitely something that I've used in terms of making those observations when leading teams and projects, because actually we're all so caught up in our own little worlds that actually pausing, stepping out the situation, and maybe just focusing on someone else and seeing how they're thinking or feeling, it's actually quite hard to do sometimes.
Oh, I think, yeah, absolutely. That's a really good way of framing it. And often I think one of the things we can sometimes forget is actually everyone has a way of processing information or processing events, things that go on around them. And what Padesky's maintenance cycle seeks to do is capture some of that process. And, you know, one of the things that it can begin to expose for you as a person is maybe some of like what we were talking about earlier, that automaticity. So your tendency to, so when I highlighted that thought, oh, my colleague's doing that on purpose, that might be what we call kind of personalization. So it's a cognitive bias, and that's one of the things that's really, really helpful to begin to highlight. You know, how am I constantly thinking when this situation arises? Am I maybe personalizing things? Am I potentially, you know, making assumptions about things that are going on? And I think, you know, what it really is good at beginning to do is highlight that process in ourselves. And then, as you said, we can begin to maybe highlight that in other people as well. You know, maybe a more compassionate way. You're not going to just say to someone who's having a bad time or who feels castigated, you're personalizing things and come down on them like a ton of bricks. Well, I mean, you might, but I don't think that's going to help.
Absolutely. And it's interesting, I find anyway, once you start to practice awareness, how much you lack it, or I lacked it, shall we say, at least in so many areas.
Yeah, not me, I'm perfect.
Oh.
I'm only kidding.
Well, listeners, there's an opportunity for reflection there.
Absolutely. That's a good point. So get my little maintenance cycle out. What happened there? You can begin to... Sorry, continue.
No, I think that's good. But I think, you know, that humility and that sense of realizing that we're not all perfect, you know, is actually quite a big point as well, because that's something else that when you're practicing awareness, I think you should be aware of. You know, what is your own internal dialogue? Because it's, you know, taking from the first episode, we talked about success and failure and how you can frame that. People can experience situations, the same situation, in two completely different perspectives. And I think I find that really fascinating, the way the mind works, because, you know, broadly speaking, you could say that we've got some people who are more emotionally focused and more people who are logically focused. And actually, we can charge through life without realizing that maybe someone's got a tendency to the others. And I do think, what you were talking about with that model is something that's a really useful framework. I think what's also really interesting is that ideology in a weird way isn't new. It might be new in the sense of a framework, but take Marcus Aurelius's Meditations. He talks around the senses of the body, the impulses of the soul, and actually the judgment of the mind. And so it's something that we as humans have always had to grapple with. And I think it's a blessing and a curse in the sense that, you talked about the fact that us with our first recording of this episode, overthinking it, not being, not really understanding what the bigger picture was that we were trying to do and jumping on something, but also then the inverse of that, of where you can almost, not have that sense of awareness to yourself and others. And it's something that to this day we all still have to practice. Otherwise frameworks like Padesky's wouldn't have evolved, and that quote from Marcus Aurelius would have been said and didn't resonate anymore.
People could have just cast it aside. It reminds me quite distinctly of something that Frederick Langbridge said in his, I think it's Quiet Thoughts. Can't quite remember the body of work that it's from, but he says, two men look out from the same bars, or two prisoners rather than men look out from the same bars. One looks out and sees the mud while the other sees the stars. And, kind of a couple of things affect, I suppose, how we process things. So it might be our experiences, but it's also kind of our relationship to those experiences, and how we shift our focus, how we kind of notice our thoughts, challenge our thoughts, or accept our thoughts. Quite important parts in, I suppose, framing things like awareness, which does go on to affect how intentional you want to be, because often we act on our thoughts. So, you might have heard the expression, perception is 9/10 of reality. And a bit like our kind of Padesky model, where we're talking about the person who thinks that their co-worker is talking deliberately to annoy them. They see that person in a very particular light, and that kind of fractures how well they might be able to work with that person, or kind of other people in their sphere, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. And I think, awareness is definitely the key message I think we're saying here. And I think there's different ways that people can practice it. You can have those frameworks that we've talked about. I think you can practice being present in the moment. One thing I've noticed recently is a simple activity of walking the dog and leaving my phone at home. Well, to me, I therefore stopped reaching my phone. But what I then noticed I was doing, interestingly, was instead of actually being present with nature, I was spending most of the walk consumed by my own thoughts. And actually, that just in the moment of, we've talked about feelings, but also thoughts, what's going on around us. And I think a practice that's talking it in the moment, but a practice that I think I have definitely seen benefits from around is meditation. And actually, making some observations from a point of view where maybe you're not within the body, you're being that casual observer from the mind's eye or the third eye, or, a casual observer
that
from a
curious
distance.
Scientist that we mentioned earlier.
Curious scientist, exactly.
He always makes a return back to do his studies.
Absolutely. And that curiosity... Sorry, go on.
No, please.
Well, I was just going to say that curiosity there is, I think that's really a key bit around awareness, is having that curiosity in the first place of what it is I'm thinking, because inadvertently, me solving the problem of not having been attached to my phone, I then almost went from a pendulum swing to being micro-analytical on my phone and trying to pick it up and do things, to being completely consumed by my own thoughts. And actually, I'm out in nature, walking, trying to be present. And where I was going to go with that was that actually meditation, in terms of what am I feeling, what am I hearing, playing with my senses and scanning and feeling those thoughts, is something that I've actually found really useful as a reflective tool to be able to work through and practice bringing that awareness back and almost just observing my thoughts.
It's quite interesting because hearing you talk, I think we're starting to move towards what I call the second part of intentionality. So I think intentionality comes in two parts. The first part is the awareness. So that's almost like your why, what's happening. And then the second part is purpose. And I like to deem that as action. So that's your so what. So we've got the knowledge in one hand. So great, you've got fantastic insight into what's going on. And then we're kind of leaning into that second part of, well, so what? What are you going to do with it? And what you noticed there was you developed the why. My phone's taking up too much time. It's consuming too much and it's stopping me being more aware and kind of focusing and de-stressing. Left it at home. That was the action. And you kind of led to another sort of situation where you're like, actually, this new problem's come up. Why has that come up? And then you've developed another action, which is I need to kind of meditate. I need to kind of, I suppose, develop some space between me and my thoughts. And I suppose in that moment, you're kind of accessing those two parts of intentionality. You developed your why and you developed your set of actions to cope with that, or to, I suppose, be more intentional.
Absolutely. And I think that purpose is really key, because without it, the awareness is just that awareness, Absolutely. And that in itself, if you just keep observing the same thing, but you're not necessarily moving in the direction that you want from it or taking that action, then it is, that is a key aspect of intentionality. And I think something you said there, and it's a quote that, or something that I've sat on before and played with, is around actions over feeling. And I think I'll start by saying, we're not saying don't have feelings. What we're saying is,
saying that. Yeah.
Don't be consumed by your feelings to the point that it breeds inaction. So a simple one could be not feeling like going to the gym on a Sunday morning and actually just putting your shoes on and getting out that door, and doing them the best you can that day. It doesn't mean going and spending 3 hours slogging in the gym, but you're being intentional. You need to move. You want to move. And that actions over feeling piece, I think, comes to exactly what you were just saying around the purpose from it, is that you've built that awareness. You've maybe reflected. You've maybe meditated. You've maybe used Padesky's framework or another tool that you feel serves you in developing that awareness. And then you've moved on to apply it in terms of intentionality. And, actions over feeling, I think, is a huge part on an individual basis, but also for, I think, others as well, in teams or working through things. Because I think if we notice that if people ruminate just in their feelings and they're not necessarily sharing, that actually what you can find is that people are completely consumed by their feelings. And actually, that in itself can be a negative.
Yeah, and I think there's a little bit there to touch on, because obviously when we think about feelings, what the role of them is evolutionarily and kind of biologically, is they drive us to do things. And I think sometimes they're really good, because obviously they help humans survive. So, they motivate you to do things like eat. They motivate you to do things like run away from danger. All really useful functions and really helpful functions. But it's thinking about kind of, when is that feeling unhelpful? So that feeling of kind of lethargy that you just described, when someone's like, I don't really want to go to the gym, or kind of demotivation, don't want to go to the gym. And it becomes that question of, well, and you start to do this on a cognitive level. You've still got that physical sensation, but I suppose what you're talking about there is questioning, well, if I don't go to the gym, is it going to bring me closer to the thing that I need or want? Is that going to help me live within the life that I value? And you're talking about practicing, what we call in DBT or dialectical behavioral therapy as opposite action. So, in some regards, we think about that skill in quite an extreme set of examples or circumstances. But in this case, it can be used in kind of those other areas, like going to the gym, driving yourself cognitively to do it.
That's really interesting, actually, because I think that drive and awareness of kind of that purpose is such a key point that goes with that awareness. Is, you know, hearing what you're saying there, and there's different tools that come with it, because I think, or something I've definitely noticed is I've kind of wandered through life or read or listened and observed, is that a quote that really, I think I really do live by, and I think it has a lot of weight to it, and it's probably quite an agitative kind of quote in a way for some people, but it goes along the lines of, the person who thinks they can and the person who thinks they can't are both right. And actually that purpose will really pick the destination that you choose. You know, if you're driven by that purpose and you're aware of your actions and you've built that awareness and you're moving towards a more intentional life, then you're going to move more towards that can space. You know, if you're unable to do that, then actually you'll move towards the opposite direction.
And I think actually, yeah, that kind of relationship with yourself in your head that we're talking about, so that idea of I can't do this, you know, I'll never achieve this. If you buy into that, you know, you'll act on those thoughts. And that's kind of what Padesky's is really good at capturing. And I suppose that's why we brought it to this, well, I brought it to this conversation, because that quote is a good example. It's a good way of thinking about self-efficacy and how our thoughts and our kind of our discussion or discourse with ourselves internally can shape and act, will cause us to act in certain ways. So if I kind of sit there and believe that I can't do a certain thing, I'm not going to try.
Absolutely. Is there an example that you feel you could share with the listeners to kind of frame something that, you know, you've personally worked through in that space?
Yeah, you know, I think one of the biggest things I think I ever thought about where I came across that barrier was I think I was about 18 and I was studying for an exam. I can't even remember what the exam was. And I went in initially with the idea that I can't do this. I've never sat at a university level exam before, and it kind of a really, really shaky self-belief system. So much so that I looked for evidence to substantiate that belief, and that's another example of a cognitive bias, because we don't always look for, I suppose, information to disprove how we already think. We look for it to substantiate what we believe already, and that's called filtering. Or even and confirmation bias is another good example of kind of how we kind of sort through information. And I suppose what I did was, you know, I accumulated all this belief that I was going to fail, and I sat down and I opened the exam paper and I saw a question. I think it was a law, social work law paper that was sitting, and I saw a question. I'm like, I know exactly how to answer this. I've seen this 1,000 times. And suddenly I started to look for evidence that proved that I knew what I was talking about. And in effect, kind of beginning to reverse that negative self-belief in the middle of the exam. And I don't know if that's kind of a skill that I have or don't have, but in that moment, I just was given enough evidence to say, I know what I'm doing. And that made the other questions that I didn't know how to answer feel less pointed or less weighty. Does that kind of answer what you were asking?
I think massively. I think that will ruminate a lot with all the listeners. You know, I think there are a few people out there, and this is a shout out to them, that really enjoy exams. But I think on the majority, most of us are nervous by them. And I think, you know, hearing what you've said there, being aware of those thoughts, then acting intentionally, and then the drive that you then got from that and how, you know, frictionless the rest of it became, really demonstrates that actually, in many ways, it's all internal. And that is challenging and also, I think, an amazing opportunity for everyone in that sense, because it is scary to realize that in some ways you are limiting yourself and actually your own abilities to, shall we say, distort reality can reframe it and bring you into completely different perspectives. And I think while that could be scary, I think the focus people should see is that actually you can change, you can achieve what you want to do, and actually through some awareness, through some purpose, and then applied intentionality, you can get to where you want to be.
Yeah, and I think one of the key takeaways is we make this kind of statement that it can be an internal experience. And I think instead of it being kind of completely an internal experience, it's definitely a significant factor or a significant kind of part of kind of what you kind of go through as a person. But I think one of the biggest takeaways as well is that your mind is going to throw up a lot of thoughts, and not all of them are correct. And often we treat every thought that we have as if it's A, really important, and B, completely true or 100% true. And it's just remembering that actually, is this a fact or is this just a thought? And
I think, sorry, go on.
So no, continue.
I wanted to pick up exactly what you said and link two things together there, actually, because you mentioned filtering earlier and truth. Mm-hmm. And I think what's ironic is, I'm thinking this because I can think of many examples where I've done this to myself. Mm-hmm. But if you and I had a friend who kept lying to themselves and to us, we're not going to believe them as much. Mm. And yet, every day, in many ways, you could lie to yourself through your own thoughts, but you don't apply that same level of mistrust. And I think what I'm saying with that is not necessarily a criticism, but it's the point that you said about filtering. Mm-hmm. How trustworthy is what I'm feeling? Actually, how trustworthy is it? And applying that filter in our thoughts and how beneficial that can be.
I suppose it comes back to that idea of rather it being trustworthy, it's treating it as I've got a hypothesis. This thought today, so my thought, let's take my failed exam example. I'm about to fail my exam. Okay, I'm going to walk in and I'm going to fail. And I treat that thought as a hypothesis. So hypothesis A is saying I'm going to fail. And obviously this is quite you've got to sit down and begin to think about this. And there are many ways to do that, but this is just an example of how I do it. So I sit there and I go, well, what's the evidence for hypothesis A being likely? I can't necessarily think of anything off the top of my head, aside from a couple of things like this worried feeling I have in my tummy and that I've never sat a university exam before. So those are the two bits of evidence I'm using to evaluate hypothesis A. Now let's think about hypothesis B, that I might do relatively well at the exam. So the opposite thought, I'm going to pass. And I sit there and I go, well, what's the evidence for that? Well, I've had a whole semester's worth of teaching on this specific subject. I've revised really quite diligently, quite regularly. I've had spot checks from all my classmates, and actually my mocks came back really high. And there we have to weigh up what seems more likely, not inherently true, but what seems more likely, because obviously we could sit there and argue, there's always a possibility that you still do fail your exam. But it's the way of taking the sting out of some of that ruminative thinking.
Definitely. And I think, that wraps up really well. Awareness, purpose, and intentionality. And that's a really good kind of, I think, way of just looping it all together for everybody and giving a really vivid example of where you've applied that. So thank you for sharing that with everyone. So if we then step back from that as a reflection on this and actually kind of look to what people can do as some of the key takeaways from today, particularly around now reflecting on the quote from today's episode, which was making a decision today that tomorrow's you will be proud of. What are some principles that you think some of the listeners can take from today's episode?
That's a really good question. I think the biggest principle that I would encourage people to take thought forward is the idea that your thoughts are thoughts. They're not necessarily facts. And you have to be curious about, one, your experience, kind of, so what triggered that thought, what triggered that emotion, but also start to treat your thoughts in a more objective way. And that might just start with the question of, I'm noticing that I'm having the thought of X. And you might begin to dissect that a little bit. Where does that come from? What's the opposite thought of this thought? Can I let it go? Can I not let it go? If I can't let it go, shall I challenge the thought? How do I do that? And you might do that through, what I described earlier, hypothesis A and hypothesis B. So I think that's a big takeaway for me. What about you? What do you suggest?
I think that practicing that awareness piece that you talked to is definitely the first element. I think the second element to me for people is around applying that kind of judgment to those things that you've become aware of. And I don't mean judgmental in your own self, but in terms of, is it serving me? It's that actions over feeling piece. Don't just always let your emotions and feelings dictate what you do. Keep focused on what you want to achieve. Stay disciplined to that. And always try, where you can, to act with intention.
And I think a really beautiful thing to add as well, coming back to our podcast debacle where we re-recorded every episode, being intentional doesn't necessarily mean you're going to get it right every time, but it's a step toward the thing that you want to kind of value and achieve, basically.
Absolutely. And you have to start somewhere. And I think we all think we're going to be good at it. And actually, there's a hack for everyone. You're not going to be good. And the quicker you accept you're not going to be good first time, the quicker you will become good.
Yeah. I think I said something to you a little while ago. Embarrassment's the price of entry, or the cost of entry. Sometimes you've got to get it a little wrong before you get it a lot right.
Embarrassment is the cost of entry. Well, there you have it. Episode 2.
Yeah. Thanks for listening. And remember, like and subscribe. Or don't. It's up to you.
If you found this useful, do share it with someone close to you, or share it with someone random that you bump into. Let's all try and live a little more intentionally.